Hello, this is Sylvia from Manchester Libraries, and I want to talk to you more about detective stories and why I love them. Last time I told to you about my love of the Sherlock Holmes novels, and I still love them very much. And because of that, I was looking for a different version of Sherlock Holmes, and I found one that is amazing in the Russell and Holmes mysteries by Laurie R. King. The first one of those is called The Beekeeper's Apprentice. It's set in 1915, so Sherlock Holmes is in his 50s, he has retired from London, and he is living in the South Downs to keep bees. He lives with Mrs. Hudson, and Dr. Watson is still nearby and drops in occasionally to visit. But really, Sherlock Holmes is living the quiet life, looking after his bees and walking the countryside. The narrator of these book series is a young woman called Mary Russell. She is newly orphaned and in 1915 is 15 years old. I love her character. She's amazing. One of the things that I really love about her is that she has her own mind and her own life, and whilst Sherlock Holmes is part of that, he will only ever really be a part of that and not her whole life. She has her own motivations. She's a student, she's an academic, she's incredibly clever, she's very smart and independent, and their relationship really depends on that independence. It's one of the foundation stones, and it's a great way of describing how Holmes could relate to someone who is his equal. Watson always put Holmes on a pedestal and made him untouchable. And with Russell, we just have a completely different narrator and a different character who makes Holmes a lot more human and looks at him through eyes that are more, um, I guess, even to his own. So they are looking eye to eye, so to speak. I'm going to read you a section of the start of the novel, and you'll get to judge for yourself. So, like I said, it's 1915. Russell is living with her aunt, whom she dislikes, so she spends a lot of time walking the South Downs, reading, as it is on this day. She has her nose in a book, she is reading Virgil and walking through the countryside. As she does this, she comes across a man who is sitting in the countryside, and she nearly runs him over because she's not looking where she's going. He is very condescending towards her, which makes her very angry, rightfully so, and we will pick up with them in the middle of this argument. His innocent words and his far from innocent manner hit my smouldering temper like a splash of petrol. My shoulders went back, my chin up, as I stiffened for combat. I had no idea where I was, or who this man was, whether I was standing on his land or he on mine, if he was a dangerous lunatic or an escaped convict, or the lord of the manor, and I did not care. I was furious. "You have not answered my question, sir," I bit off. He ignored my fury. Worse than that, he seemed unaware of it. He looked merely bored, as if he wished I might go away. "What I am doing here, do you mean?" "Exactly. I am watching bees," he said flatly, and turned back to his contemplation of the hillside. Nothing in the man's manner showed a madness to correspond with his words. Nonetheless, I kept a wary eye on him as I thrust my book into my coat pocket and dropped to the ground, a safe distance away from him, and studied the movement of the flowers before me. There were indeed bees, industriously working at stuffing pollen into those leg scacks of theirs, moving from flower to flower. I watched as I was just thinking there was nothing particularly noteworthy about these bees when my eye was caught by the arrival of a particularly marked specimen. It seemed an ordinary honeybee, but had a small red spot on its back. How odd. Perhaps he had been watching? I glanced at the eccentric, who was now staring intently off into space, and then looked more closely at the bees, interested in spite of myself. I quickly concluded that the spot was no natural phenomenon, but rather paint, for there was another bee, its spot slightly lopsided, and another, and then another odd thing, a bee with a blue spot as well. As I watched, 2 red spots flew off into a northwesterly direction. I carefully observed the blue and red spot as it filled its pouches, saw it take off towards the northeast. I thought for a minute, got up, and walked to the top of the hill, scattering ewes and lambs, and when I looked down at the village and river I knew instantly where I was. My house was less than 2 miles from here. I shook my head ruefully at my inattention, thought for a moment longer about this man and his red and blue spotted bees, and walked back down to take my leave of him. He did not look up, so I spoke to the back of his head. I'd say the blue spots are a better bet if you're trying for another hive. The ones you've only marked with red are probably from Mr. Walnut's orchard. The blue spots are further away, but they're almost sure to be wild ones. I dug the book from my pocket, and when I looked up to wish him a good day, he was looking back at me with the expression on his face. All words slipped from my lips. No mean accomplishment. He was, as the writers say, but people seldom actually are, open-mouthed. He looked a bit like a fish, in fact, keeping at me as if I were growing another head. He slowly stood up, his mouth shutting as he rose, but still staring. What did you say? I beg your pardon, are you hard of hearing? I raised my voice somewhat and spoke slowly. I said, if you want a new hive, you will have to follow the blue spots, because the reds are sure to be Tom Warner's. I am not hard of hearing, although I am short of credulity. How do you come to know of my interests? I should have thought it obvious, I said impatiently, though even at that age I was aware that such things were not obvious to the majority of people. I see paint on your pocket handkerchief and traces on your fingers where you wiped it away. The only reason to mark the bees I can think of is to enable one to follow them to their hives. You are either interested in gathering honey or in the bees themselves, and it is not the time of year to harvest honey. 3 months ago, we had an unusual cold spell that killed many hives. Therefore, I assume that you are tracking these in order to replenish your own stock. The face that looked down at me was no longer fish-like. In fact, it resembled amazingly a captive eagle I had once seen, perched in aloof splendor looking down the ridge of its nose at its lesser creatures, cold disdain staring out from its hooded grey eyes. My God, he said in the voice of mock wonder, it can think. My anger had abated somewhat while watching the bees, but at this casual insult it erupted. Why was this tall, thin, infuriating old man so set on provoking an unoffending stranger? My chin went up again, only in part because he was taller than I, and I mocked him in return. My God, it can recognize another human being when it's hit over the head with one. For good measure I added, and to think that I had been raised to believe that old people had decent manners. I stood back to watch my blows strike home, and as I faced him squarely, my mind's eye finally linked him up with rumours I had heard and the reading I had done during my recent long convalescence, and I knew who he was, and I was appalled. I had, I should mention, always assumed that a large part of Dr. Watson's adulatory stories were a product of that gentleman's inferior imagination. Certainly, he always regarded the reader to be as slow as himself. Most irritating. Nonetheless, behind the stuff and nonsense of the biographer, there towered a figure of pure genius, one of the great minds of his generation, a legend. And I was horrified. Here I was, standing before a legend, flinging insults at him, yapping about his ankles like a small dog worrying at a bear. I suppressed a cringe and braced myself for the casual swat that would send me flying. To my amazement, however, and considerable dismay, instead of counter-attacking, he just smiled condescendingly and bent down to pick up his rucksack. I heard the faint rattle of the paint bottles within. He straightened, pushed his old-fashioned cap back into his greying hair, and looked at me with tired eyes. Young man, Young man! That did it. Rage swept into my veins, filling me with power. Granted, I was far from voluptuous. Granted, I was dressed in practical, that is, male attire. But this was not to be borne. Fear aside, legend aside, the yapping lapdog attacked with all the utter contempt only an adolescent can muster. With a surge of glee, I seized the weapon he had placed in my hands and drew back for the coup de grace. Young man, I repeated, it's a damned good thing that you did retire, if that all that remains of the great detective's mind. And with that, I reached for the brim of my oversized cap, and my long blonde plait slithered down over my shoulders. A series of emotions crossed his face, rich reward for my victory. Simple surprise was followed by a rueful admission of defeat, and then, as he reviewed the entire discussion, he surprised me. His face relaxed, his thin lips twitched, his grey eyes crinkled into unexpected lines. At last he threw back his head and gave a great shout of delighted laughter. That was the first time I heard Sherlock Holmes laugh, and although it was far from the last, it never ceased to surprise me, seeing that proud, ascetic face dissolve into helpless laughter. His amusement was, at least partially, at himself, and this time was no exception. I was totally disarmed. Okay, so if you've liked this section of the book, please borrow it from Borrowbox. You can do that with your library card, and I hope you enjoy it. I hope you've liked this video. If you did, please also subscribe to the Manchester Library's YouTube channel, and you will get updates for when we post other videos. And yeah, just keep safe and let us know what you're reading. Bye.